He wasn't supposed to hesitate, not after years of training, not after commands drilled into bone and breath, not when a voice of authority cut through the cold morning air with absolute certainty. Release the dog. Because obedience was the first rule and doubt was the first thing they trained out of you, yet somehow, in that suspended second between command and action, something unseen shifted. The square was quiet except for the faint hum of traffic a block away and the distant wail of a siren echoing off brick buildings, a gray sky hanging low like it was waiting for something to break, and in the center of it all stood an old man, thin shoulders wrapped in a worn coat that had seen too many winters, his hands trembling not from fear alone but from time itself, the kind that slows everything except judgment, and beside the line of officers, muscles coiled beneath a sleek sable coat, stood Rex. A German shepherd built for precision, for discipline, for action measured in split seconds, his amber eyes fixed forward, ears sharp, body aligned with purpose, AK-9 who had never once failed to respond, never once questioned, because that was never part of the job. And yet, as Officer Daniel Hayes unclipped the leash with practiced fingers, something in Rex's posture held, not resistance, not defiance, just a pause so subtle most wouldn't notice. But Daniel did, because after years together, you learn the language that isn't spoken, you learn the difference between readiness and hesitation, and this was something else entirely. The command came again, sharper this time, Captain Victor Cole's voice cutting through the air with impatience. And heads turned, cameras lifted from curious onlookers who sensed tension but not its source. The old man didn't move, didn't plead, didn't run, he just stood there as if rooted to a truth no one else could see, his eyes not on the officers but on the dog. As if he understood something the rest of them didn't, and then Rex moved. A burst of controlled energy, paws striking pavement in a rhythm as precise as a heartbeat, closing the distance in seconds, every ounce of training carrying him forward. And for a brief moment, everything aligned exactly as it was supposed to be, until it wasn't. Because just as he reached the man, just as the outcome seemed inevitable, Rex slowed, his stride breaking, his head turning ever so slightly, not toward the man, but past him, as if something else had entered the equation, something unseen but undeniable, and in that instant, the air itself seemed to hold its breath. Daniel's pulse spiking as instinct whispered louder than protocol. Because Rex never broke pattern, never hesitated, never chose anything but the command, and yet here he was, standing between expectation and something deeper, something older than training, his chest rising, his gaze locked not on the fragile figure before him but somewhere beyond, where truth often hides in plain sight, waiting for the one soul willing to notice. Daniel did not call him back, not yet, because something in his chest tightened in a way that training could not explain. The kind of quiet warning that does not come from manuals or command chains but from years of standing beside the same animal and learning that instinct can sometimes outrank authority. And Rex stood there unmoving, his body forming a barrier between the old man and the line of officers as if that had been the mission all along, his tail still, his ears forward, his focus sharp but not aggressive, and that was what made it wrong, because this was not how it was supposed to look, not how it was supposed to feel. And Captain Cole took a step forward, his polished boots echoing against the concrete, his voice lower now but edged with something colder than before. Officer Hayes, correct your dog. And Daniel swallowed, his hand hovering near the leash that no longer held anything, his eyes flicking between Rex and the man behind him, trying to find the missing piece, because Rex was not confused, Rex was choosing, and that thought alone unsettled him more than any direct disobedience ever could. The crowd had grown quieter now, phones raised but voices hushed, sensing that something deeper than a simple enforcement was unfolding. The old man shifted slightly, just enough for Daniel to catch the movement, not an attempt to escape, not even fear, but a small, careful motion as if he did not want to startle the dog, and there was something in his face, something steady despite everything around him, something that did not match the accusation that had been spoken moments earlier. And Rex caught it too, because his head tilted just a fraction, nostrils flaring as he drew in the air, sorting through layers of scent the way only he could, dust, pavement, faint traces of oil from passing cars, and then something else, something older, something buried beneath the present moment like a memory that refused to stay hidden, and his posture changed again, not toward the man, but toward the space just beyond Daniel's line of sight, toward Captain Cole, and it was subtle, almost imperceptible, but Daniel saw it, the shift of weight, the narrowing of those amber eyes, the quiet recalibration of attention, and suddenly the command from seconds ago felt misplaced. Like it had been aimed at the wrong target entirely. "Rex!" Daniel called softly, not as an order, but as a question, and the dog did not break his stance, did not retreat, did not advance, he simply held that invisible line, and in that stillness, the world seemed to reorganize itself around a single, uncomfortable truth, that sometimes the one trained to obey is the first to recognize when something is not right, and Captain Cole's expression tightened, just for a moment. A flicker that most would miss, but not Daniel, because now he was watching everything differently, not just the dog, not just the man, but the space between them, the tension that did not belong, and for the first time since the command was given, doubt did not feel like weakness, it felt like clarity. The air shifted again, quieter now but heavier, like the moment before a storm decides whether to pass or break, and Daniel could feel every pair of eyes pressing in, waiting for resolution that refused to come, because Rex still had not moved, not forward, not back, just holding that line with a kind of calm that did not belong in a situation built on urgency. And it was in that stillness that Daniel noticed something he had missed before, the way the old man's breathing remained steady despite everything, slow and measured, as if he had already accepted whatever would come next, and more than that, the faint scent that drifted between them, not fear, not panic, but something metallic and distant, something that did not belong to him, and Rex caught it again, stronger this time, his nose lifting slightly as if tracing a path invisible to everyone else. His gaze sharpening toward Captain Cole with a quiet intensity that no longer felt accidental, and Daniel felt it too now, not the scent itself but the implication of it, the subtle unraveling of certainty that begins when small details refuse to align. "Stand down," Cole said, his tone controlled but tighter than before, and for a moment it sounded less like an order and more like a correction, as if he was trying to rewrite what had already happened, but Rex did not respond, because the command had not come from the right place, not from the truth his instincts were locked onto, and Daniel took a slow step forward, careful, deliberate, not wanting to disrupt whatever fragile balance had formed. "Sir," he said, voice low, respectful, but carrying something new beneath it, something that had not been there minutes ago. "He is not reacting to the subject." And the words hung in the air longer than they should have, because everyone understood what they meant even if no one wanted to say it out loud. The subject was not the old man, and Captain Cole's jaw tightened just enough to confirm it. A flicker of something guarded passing through his expression before it disappeared behind practiced authority. But Rex did not need confirmation, he already knew, his body shifting slightly now, not aggressive, not threatening, just realigning his stance in a way that placed him more clearly between Cole and the man behind him, and it was such a simple movement, almost gentle. Yet it carried more weight than any command shouted across the square, because it told a story no one could ignore anymore. And Daniel's pulse slowed as clarity settled in, not sudden, not dramatic, just a quiet understanding building piece by piece, memory by memory, until it formed something solid enough to stand on. Because Rex had done this before, not in a square, not in front of cameras, but in places where decisions meant everything, where hesitation could not exist unless it mattered, and every time, without fail, it had meant something, and Daniel trusted that more than he trusted the moment, more than he trusted the command, more than he trusted the man who gave it, and as he looked at Rex now, truly looked, he saw not defiance, not confusion, but recognition, the kind that comes when instinct finds something it has been trained to never ignore, and suddenly the silence around them did not feel empty anymore. It felt like the beginning of something being uncovered, something that had been hidden in plain sight, waiting for the one soul who could not be taught to look away. Daniel exhaled slowly, the kind of breath that does not release tension but reshapes it, because now every detail felt sharpened, every sound more deliberate, the faint shuffle of shoes in the crowd, the soft hum of a phone recording, the distant wind brushing through the empty corners of the square, and in the center of it all, Rex stood unmoved, anchored not by command but by something deeper. Something Daniel had learned to recognize long before he understood it, and Captain Cole stepped closer again, this time with a measured calm that felt practiced, controlled. "This is not a discussion, officer," he said, voice even, but there was a tightness beneath it, something held back, something not quite aligning with the authority he carried, and Daniel nodded slightly, respectful on the surface. But inside, something had already shifted, because the moment Rex chose differently, the rules changed, even if no one had said it out loud, and the old man behind Rex lifted his gaze for the first time toward Daniel, not pleading, not desperate, just steady, like someone who had been waiting a long time for something to finally stop and listen, and Daniel caught it, that quiet weight in the man's eyes, not fear, but exhaustion, the kind that comes from being dismissed too many times, and Rex adjusted again, a subtle step forward, not toward the man, but angling his body more directly toward Cole, his posture still calm, still controlled, but undeniably protective, and it was that word that settled into Daniel's mind, not attack, not restraint, but protection, and it did not belong to the man who had been accused, it belonged to the moment itself, and then Rex lowered his head slightly, not in submission, but in focus, drawing in another breath, deeper this time. His chest expanding as if pulling in layers of time rather than just air, and something clicked, not loudly, not dramatically. Just a quiet alignment of memory and instinct, and Daniel saw it in the way Rex's ears flicked back for a fraction of a second before locking forward again, the same pattern he had seen once before, miles away from this place, in a different kind of tension, where the air had carried the same faint metallic trace, the same subtle note of something that did not belong, and Daniel's gaze shifted slowly to Cole, really looking now not at the uniform, not at the rank, but at the small details that usually went unnoticed, the faint crease in his sleeve where something had been recently adjusted, the slight sheen on his gloves that caught the light differently than it should have, the almost imperceptible hesitation in his breathing when Rex's attention fixed on him. And none of it was proof, not on its own, but together it formed something harder to ignore. Something that did not fit the clean narrative that had been presented just minutes ago, and the crowd felt it too, not understanding, but sensing, because silence has a way of carrying truth before words can catch up, and Daniel took another step forward, placing himself just behind Rex, not pulling him back, not correcting him, but standing with him, and it was a small choice, almost invisible, yet it shifted the entire weight of the moment, because now it was no longer just a dog holding the line. It was a man choosing to trust what could not be easily explained, and Cole's eyes narrowed slightly, the calm beginning to thin at the edges. "Officer Hayes," he said again, slower now, more deliberate. "Stand your dog down." And Daniel felt the words land, heavy, familiar, the kind of command that once would have ended everything in an instant, but now it lingered unanswered, because Rex did not move, and neither did he, and in that suspended space between order and action, something rare and fragile began to surface, not loud, not undeniable yet, but present enough to change everything, because sometimes the truth does not arrive with force, it arrives quietly, carried on breath, on instinct, on the unwavering stance of a dog who refuses to look away. The moment stretched longer than it should have, long enough for doubt to take root in places where certainty once lived, and Daniel could feel it spreading, not just within himself but through the officers behind him, through the quiet crowd watching with held breath, because something fundamental had shifted and no one could pretend otherwise anymore, and Rex remained steady, unwavering, his presence no longer just a reaction but a statement. A line drawn without words, and Daniel lowered his voice, just enough so it did not carry beyond the space between them. "Rex, easy!" Not as a command but as reassurance, because he was not trying to control the dog now, he was trying to understand him, and Rex flicked his ear back at the sound, acknowledging, but not yielding, his attention still locked forward, still anchored to something unseen yet undeniable, and that was when the old man finally spoke, his voice thin but clear, like something worn by time yet not broken. "He knows," he said softly, not to anyone in particular, but the words landed all the same, and Daniel glanced back, surprised not by the voice itself but by the calm within it, because there was no panic, no urgency, just a quiet certainty that felt strangely out of place in a moment like this, and before Daniel could respond, Captain Cole stepped in again, closing the distance with controlled precision, his presence now sharper, less patient. "That is enough," he said, and there was something final in the tone, something that did not invite interpretation, but Daniel did not move, not this time, because the more Cole spoke, the more something beneath the surface began to show, not in what he said but in how he said it, the slight tightening of his jaw, the almost imperceptible pause before each word, the way his eyes never fully settled on Rex, and Rex noticed too, his posture shifting again, just slightly, his head lowering a fraction more, his nose drawing in another measured breath, and then it happened, small enough that most would miss it, but Daniel did not. Rex let out a low sound, not a growl, not a warning, but something quieter, deeper. The kind of sound he only made when something did not belong, when a pattern broke in a way that demanded attention, and Daniel felt it resonate in his chest, because he had heard it before, in moments where instinct caught what sight could not, and his gaze followed Rex's line again, settling fully on Cole now, not as a superior, not as a commander, but as a variable in a situation that no longer made sense, and that was when Daniel noticed the detail that should have been obvious all along, the faint mark along Cole's sleeve. Subtle but out of place, like something recently brushed against it, something not from this clean, controlled environment, and the memory clicked, not loudly, not with certainty, but enough to shift the ground beneath his feet, because Rex was not reacting to the man behind him, he was reacting to something carried by the man in front of him, something that did not belong here, something that had followed him into this moment, and Daniel took one more step forward, aligning himself fully with Rex now, not behind, not separate, but beside, and the decision settled quietly, without announcement, without defiance, just a simple, irreversible choice to trust what could not yet be explained, and the crowd leaned in closer, not physically, but in attention, because even without understanding, they could feel it too, that something real was beginning to surface, something that had been hidden beneath authority and assumption, and Captain Cole saw it slipping, just for a moment. The control, the certainty, the narrative he had carried into this square, and though his posture remained firm, there was a flicker there, brief but undeniable, and Rex did not miss it, his eyes narrowing just slightly as if confirming what instinct had already told him, and in that quiet exchange, between man, dog, and the truth neither could yet fully name, the balance shifted again, this time in a way that would not easily return. It was no longer about a command, and it was no longer about control, because something older than both had taken hold of the moment, something that could not be forced back into place once it had surfaced, and Daniel felt it settle deep in his chest, steady and unshakable, the kind of certainty that does not arrive all at once but builds quietly until it becomes impossible to ignore, and Rex stood firm beside him. Not tense, not aggressive, just present, his breathing slow, his focus unwavering, as if he had already made his decision long before anyone else realized there was one to make, and Captain Cole shifted his weight slightly, just enough to break the stillness, his voice returning with a sharper edge. "Officer Hayes, this situation is over." But the words did not land the same way anymore, they did not carry the same weight, because the moment had already moved beyond them, and Daniel did not respond immediately, not out of defiance, but because he was listening. Not to Cole, not to the crowd, but to the quiet language unfolding in front of him, the one Rex had been speaking from the start, and then the old man took a slow step forward, careful, deliberate, his movement small but meaningful, and Rex did not stop him, did not react with alarm, instead he shifted just enough to allow it, maintaining his position while acknowledging the change. And the man reached into the worn coat at his side, his fingers moving slowly, not hiding anything, not rushing, just revealing, and Daniel felt the tension ripple outward as every eye fixed on that motion, waiting, expecting something that would justify the command that had started all of this. But what emerged was not a threat, not anything dangerous, just a small, weathered object, metal dulled by time, held carefully in the man's hand, and even from a distance Daniel could see the shape, the familiar lines, the quiet significance of it. A badge, old, worn, but unmistakable, and the man held it out. Slightly, not as a defense, not as proof, but as something that had simply been overlooked for too long, and his voice came again, softer now, but steadier than before. I tried to tell them, he said, and there was no anger in it, just a kind of tired truth, and Daniel's gaze flicked back to Cole, and this time the change was clearer, the control thinner, the calm more fragile, and Rex saw it too, his ears angling forward, his body leaning just a fraction in that direction, not advancing, not threatening, just acknowledging what had finally come into the open, and Daniel stepped slightly to the side, creating space between the old man and the line of authority that had been closing in on him, and it was not a dramatic movement, not one that would make headlines, but it was enough to signal that the situation was no longer what it had been presented as, enough to shift the weight of assumption into something closer to truth, and the crowd responded in silence. The kind that carries more meaning than noise ever could. Phones still raised, but now recording something different, something real, and Daniel spoke at last, his voice low but clear. Sir, I think we need to reassess. And it was not a challenge, not an accusation, just a statement grounded in what was now undeniable, and Cole's jaw tightened again, but this time there was no immediate response, no quick correction, just a pause that stretched longer than it should have, and in that pause, everything became visible, the cracks in the narrative, the shift in control, the quiet truth that had been there from the beginning, carried not by words, but by the steady, unwavering instinct of a dog who refused to look away, and Rex remained where he was, between them all, not as a weapon, not as a tool, but as something far more rare, a witness that could not be persuaded, could not be silenced, and in that stillness, the balance finally tipped, not with force, not with confrontation, but with the simple, undeniable presence of truth stepping into the light. The badge caught the light for only a second, but it was enough for the shape to settle into recognition across more than one pair of eyes, enough for the quiet murmur at the edges of the crowd to rise just slightly before falling back into silence, because this was no longer a simple scene, no longer a clear line between right and wrong, and Daniel felt the weight of it press deeper into his chest as he looked from the worn metal in the old man's hand to the tightening expression on Captain Cole's face. And Rex did not move, not even when the air shifted again, because whatever he had sensed had not changed. If anything, it had become clearer, more defined, like a scent that grows stronger the closer you get to its source, and the old man lowered the badge just a little, his fingers still steady despite the years that showed in them. Arthur Bennett, he said quietly, not as an introduction, but as a reminder, as if the name itself carried something that should not have been forgotten, and Daniel felt it stir somewhere at the edge of memory, not fully formed, not yet understood, but familiar in a way that did not feel accidental, and Captain Cole stepped forward again, but this time the movement lacked the clean certainty it had carried before. There was hesitation now, subtle but present, a fraction of a second where intent seemed to catch on something unseen, and Rex saw it immediately, his posture tightening just enough to signal awareness, not aggression, just recognition, and Daniel's voice came again, calm but firmer now. Sir, we should verify. And it was a simple statement, but it shifted the ground once more, because it introduced something that had been missing from the start, doubt, not reckless, not disruptive, but necessary, and Cole's eyes flicked briefly to the badge, then away, too quickly, as if the object itself carried more weight than he wanted to acknowledge, and that was when Rex took a single step forward, slow, deliberate, closing a distance that had not been measured in feet but in truth, and he stopped just short of Cole, not invading, not threatening, simply standing within that invisible space where instinct becomes impossible to ignore, and his nose lifted slightly again, drawing in the same trace that had anchored him from the beginning, and Daniel watched closely now, not just the dog, but the man in front of him. The subtle shift in breathing, the tightening of shoulders, the way stillness replaced motion in a way that did not feel natural, and it was small, so small that anyone not looking for it would miss it entirely. But Daniel was looking now, really looking, and what he saw did not match the certainty that had been presented minutes ago, and the crowd felt it too, the shift, the slow unraveling of a story that no longer held together. And someone in the distance lowered their phone just slightly. As if realizing this was no longer something to watch from afar, but something to understand, and Arthur Bennett took another careful step, not toward escape, not toward confrontation, but simply into the space that had been denied to him before, and Rex adjusted again, not blocking him, not guiding him, just allowing, and that quiet permission spoke louder than any command, because it showed where the true line had always been drawn. And Daniel felt it settle fully now, the clarity, the decision that no longer needed to be weighed, and when he spoke again, it was not uncertain, it was not hesitant, it was grounded. "Captain, with respect, I am not moving him." And the words did not rise, did not challenge, they simply existed, steady and immovable, much like the dog beside him, and Cole's gaze hardened for a moment, but it did not carry the same authority anymore, because something had already slipped beyond his control, something he could not command back into place, and Rex held his ground, silent, watchful, unwavering, a living line between what was said and what was real, and in that space, the truth continued to rise, quiet but undeniable, carried not by force, but by the simple refusal to ignore what had been there all along. For a moment no one moved, not Daniel, not Rex, not even the wind that had been drifting lazily across the square, because something had settled into place that could not be undone by voice or rank, and Captain Cole stood there with that same rigid posture, but now it felt different, less like control and more like resistance, as if he was holding on to something already slipping away, and Daniel could see it clearly now. The small fractures in composure, the slight tightening around the eyes, the breath that no longer matched the calm exterior, and Rex remained still, but his presence had shifted from observation to quiet insistence, his focus locked, unwavering, not with aggression but with certainty, and that certainty was beginning to echo outward, reaching the officers behind Daniel, reaching the crowd, reaching even the space between words where truth often finds its way in, and Arthur Bennett lowered his hand fully now, the badge resting against his palm as if it had finally completed its purpose, and he looked at Daniel, not with relief, not with victory, but with something quieter, something like recognition, as if he understood what it meant to stand in that space between command and conscience, and Daniel gave the smallest nod, not a signal, not an instruction, just an acknowledgement, and then he shifted his stance again, not forward, not back, just enough to make it clear that the line Rex had drawn would not be crossed, and the silence stretched again, but this time it carried weight, expectation, the kind that builds just before something changes for good, and Cole exhaled slowly, a controlled breath that sounded practiced, but there was something beneath it now, something less certain, and when he spoke, his voice was quieter, measured, but missing the sharp edge it once held. "This is unnecessary," he said, and the words felt different now, not like an order, but like an attempt to contain something already beyond reach, and Daniel did not respond right away, because he did not need to, because the moment itself was speaking louder than anything he could say, and Rex shifted his weight slightly, just enough to close that invisible distance again, and for the first time, Cole stepped back, not abruptly, not noticeably to most, but enough to break the symmetry of authority he had held since the beginning. And that single step changed everything, because it revealed what had been hidden beneath posture and command, uncertainty, and the crowd felt it, a ripple of awareness moving through them, subtle but undeniable, and somewhere near the edge, a voice spoke softly, not loud enough to interrupt, but clear enough to be heard. "He is telling the truth." And no one turned to see who said it, because it no longer mattered, because the truth was no longer something that needed to be spoken, it was something that had already taken shape in the space between them, and Daniel finally moved, just one step, placing himself fully between Cole and Bennett, not confrontational, not aggressive, just present, a quiet barrier that did not need explanation, and Rex mirrored him. Instantly, their alignment seamless, practiced, but now guided by something deeper than training, and Cole's gaze lingered for a moment longer, searching perhaps for something to reclaim the moment, but finding nothing that would hold, and his shoulders lowered just slightly, the tension easing not out of acceptance, but out of inevitability, and in that shift, the outcome was decided without a single word of declaration. Because sometimes resolution does not arrive with force, it arrives with a single step backward, a single refusal to push forward, and Rex remained still, his eyes steady, his breathing calm, as if the storm had passed not because it ended, but because it had been recognized, and Daniel felt it settle in him too, not triumph, not relief, just a quiet understanding that some lines are not drawn by authority, but by truth, and once they are seen, they cannot be unseen. No one announced what came next, and maybe that was the point, because when truth finally finds its place, it does not need a voice to confirm it, it settles quietly into the spaces that once held doubt, and Daniel stood there for a moment longer, feeling the weight of everything that had just unfolded, not as a victory, not as a challenge overcome, but as something far more subtle, a correction, a line redrawn without force. And beside him Rex exhaled slowly, the first real release of tension. Since the moment began, his posture easing just enough to signal that whatever he had sensed was no longer pressing forward, and Daniel noticed it immediately. Because that was the language they shared, the silent shift from alert to calm, from watchful to certain, and he reached down without thinking. His hand resting briefly against Rex's neck, fingers brushing through the thick fur in a gesture so small it might have gone unnoticed, but it carried everything: trust, gratitude, understanding, and Rex leaned into it for just a second, not breaking his stance, just acknowledging, and then the world around them began to move again, slowly at first, like something waking from a long pause, the officers behind Daniel shifting their weight, exchanging quiet glances, the crowd lowering their phones, not because the moment had lost meaning, but because it had already said what it needed to say, and Arthur Bennett stepped forward once more, this time without hesitation, without the invisible wall that had stood in his way before, and when he reached Daniel, he stopped, not too close, not too far, just enough to be seen, and for a second neither of them spoke, because there was nothing urgent left to say. And then the old man gave a small nod, the kind that carries more history than words ever could, and Daniel returned it, just as quietly, because respect does not always need explanation, and somewhere behind them, someone spoke into a radio, low and measured, the kind of tone that signals a shift in direction, not panic, not escalation, just a change, and Captain Cole remained where he was, but the space around him felt different now, less defined, less certain, and he did not step forward again. Did not repeat the command, because the moment for that had passed, and Daniel did not look back at him, not out of disregard, but because his attention had already moved to where it mattered, to the man who had been overlooked, to the dog who had refused to look away, and to the quiet truth that now stood plainly between them all, and Rex finally shifted fully, stepping back half a pace, not retreating, just releasing the line he had held so firmly. And it was in that movement that Daniel understood something he had not put into words before, that Rex had not disobeyed, not really, he had simply chosen the right command, the one that was never spoken out loud, and Daniel unclipped the leash from where it still hung loosely in his hand, not because he needed to restrain Rex, but because he no longer needed to, and the gesture felt different now, not like control, but like trust, and Rex remained close anyway. Because loyalty does not require a tether, it chooses to stay, and the morning air felt lighter somehow, the gray sky beginning to break just enough for a thin line of sunlight to slip through, catching on the edges of buildings, on the surface of the badge still resting in Arthur Bennett's hand. And Daniel noticed it, the way the light touched it. Differently now, not hidden, not overlooked, just present, and he took a slow breath, letting it settle. Because some moments are not meant to be rushed past, they are meant to be carried forward, quietly, without announcement, and as the square began to return to its ordinary rhythm, people walking again, voices rising in low conversation, Daniel and Rex stood for one last second in that space where everything had changed. And then Daniel gave a small nod, more to himself than anyone else, and turned slightly, ready to move on, not away from what had happened, but with it, carrying the understanding that some lines are not drawn by orders or authority, but by the quiet, unwavering instinct of something that cannot be taught to lie. And as Rex walked beside him, steady and calm, Daniel knew that not every act of courage looks like action, sometimes it looks like stillness, like refusal. Like a single moment where doing nothing becomes the most important choice of all, and in that choice, two lives had been seen, one protected, and one reminded of what it truly means to serve, not just the law, but the truth that lives beneath it, waiting, always, for someone willing to listen.